They whispered her name as if it carried poison. Eleanor. Not a queen crowned in glory, but a queen draped in sin. In the halls of power, her reputation traveled faster than any army. Priests branded her a danger to the soul, chroniclers painted her in ink darker than midnight, and nobles lowered their voices when speaking of her as though even the walls might blush. They said her throne was not a seat of justice, but a stage of desire. That her chambers echoed not with prayer, but with laughter, silk, and sin. That she bewitched powerful men until crowns toppled and kingdoms shook. To many she was not a ruler, but a temptress wrapped in royal silk. Yet this is the cruel trick of history. Men remembered for conquest become heroes, but women remembered for power become scandals. Eleanor carried both the weight of authority and the burden of infamy. So which story do we believe? Was she truly the most depraved queen to ever wear a crown, indulging in lust as if it were her birthright? Or was she the victim of something far more calculated? The pens of her enemies' men who feared what they could not control, and reduced her legacy to flesh and rumor. Because one whisper can become legend, and once a scandal is born, it never dies. Tonight we step into Eleanor's world, a world of firelit chambers of politics tangled with temptation of faith, clashing with desire. A world where her crown shone as brightly as the shame her enemies tried to brand upon her. And in that world we must ask, was Eleanor truly the most lustful queen in history or the most slandered? Eleanor's story did not begin in scandal. It began in power. Born into a dynasty where blood was a weapon as sharp as any sword, she was trained from childhood to move like a queen even before she wore the crown. She learned to smile at rivals while measuring their weaknesses, to speak softly while commanding obedience. In a time when women were expected to remain shadows in the background, Eleanor was impossible to ignore. Her beauty was praised in poems, her intelligence whispered about in courts. She walked through feasts and councils like a flame in the dark, drawing eyes and sowing unease. To her allies, she was a gift. To her enemies, she was a threat. When the crown finally touched her head, it was more than a symbol. It was a warning. Here was a woman who would not be ruled by men, not even those who claimed divine right over her. She carved her place in the game of power with charm and wit, but also with an iron will hidden behind silken words. And it was then the rumors began. Whispers that she used her allure, not just to influence policy, but to bend men's hearts and bodies. That her throne was secured not by birthright or wisdom, but by seduction. The stronger her power grew, the darker the stories became. Because nothing unsettled the medieval world more than a woman who refused to play by its rules. And Eleanor broke them all. Power never exists without enemies, and for Eleanor, the fiercest of them wore robes, not armor. The church had long tolerated kings who sinned in shadows, but when a queen was accused of the same, it was treated as heresy. To them, Eleanor was not merely dangerous, she was unnatural. Priests preached against her from pulpits, warning that she was a Jezebel reborn, a corrupter of Christian virtue. Chroniclers who never once sat in her court wrote lurid accounts of her supposed excesses, claiming she held midnight feasts of wine and desire, where the boundaries of marriage and morality dissolved into ash. It was a brilliant strategy. By framing her authority as sin, the church turned politics into morality. To resist her was not to oppose a monarch, it was to defend the soul of Christendom. Every whisper of scandal became a weapon. Every story of lust was sharpened into a blade of faith. And yet beneath the sermons, there was fear. Because Eleanor represented a challenge, the church could not exorcise a woman who refused to kneel. She defied the script written for queens to serve to birth heirs, to disappear behind their husbands. Instead, she commanded armies, forged alliances, and spoke as an equal among kings. So the church painted her crown black. If her rule could not be undone through politics, it would be undone through reputation. For medieval history teaches us this: destroy the virtue of a woman, and you destroy the memory of her power. Eleanor was about to become a battlefield where faith clashed with desire and truth was the first casualty. Scandal is the oldest weapon in politics, and in Eleanor's time it was sharper than any sword. One rumor could topple trust. One whisper could erode loyalty. And Eleanor's enemies knew exactly where to strike. The stories began with soft venom, that she entertained lovers in secret chambers, that knights entered her rooms by torchlight and left before dawn, their armor rattling like guilty bells. Then came the darker inventions, orgies masked as royal banquets, vows of chastity mocked in her laughter, even suggestions that she dabbled in forbidden rites, mixing lust with sorcery. To the common people, these tales were irresistible. They spread faster than royal decrees, embroidered with every retelling, until fact and fiction were inseparable. Nobles who once toasted Eleanor now shifted uncomfortably in her presence, wondering whether their queen was a sovereign or a seductress. The scandal reached its peak when whispers crossed into court politics. Rivals claimed that laws were bent not by wisdom, but by desire, that men in Eleanor's favor were rewarded not for loyalty, but for sharing her bed. Whether true or not mattered little. The throne itself seemed compromised, its legitimacy questioned. This was not simply gossip, it was destabilization. If a queen's virtue was stained, so too was the crown she wore, and Eleanor's enemies made certain the stain was permanent. Yet scandal is a double-edged blade. For every rival who condemned her, there were allies who saw through the performance, who recognized that fear, not truth, gave birth to these stories. Still, once the image of corruption takes root, it grows like ivy, strangling even the strongest walls. And Eleanor's throne was beginning to tremble. If power is a stage, then desire is its most dangerous performance. Eleanor's court became infamous not only for its politics, but for the stories of her lovers' men, who, according to rumor, entered her chambers as knights and left as pawns. Whether those tales were true or fabricated, they reshaped the balance of power across kingdoms. Some said she used love, as others used treaties, forging intimacy where ink and parchment failed. A knight's whispered devotion could become a pledge of loyalty. A fleeting touch could mean the promise of an army. In a world where women were denied the right to negotiate as equals, Eleanor was accused of rewriting the rules, turning passion into politics. But love, even when used as strategy, is never safe. For every man who swore eternal allegiance, another felt betrayed. And betrayal is the ember from which revolutions ignite. Rivals whispered that those who fell out of her favor met ruin not by law, but by the sting of a scorned queen's vengeance. These stories fueled an image of Eleanor not as a ruler, but as a temptress who governed from the bed instead of the throne. It was a portrait painted in malice, yet it clung to her legacy with the stubbornness of truth. And worse, it gave her enemies an excuse to claim that her decisions were not rational, but emotional, not political, but sinful. Every scandalous rumor made Eleanor more vulnerable, but it also made her legend more enduring. Desire had become her crown, and her curse an inheritance she never chose, but one she could never escape. Rumors alone cannot topple a queen, but they can soften the ground for war. Eleanor's rivals knew this well, and soon whispers became armies. Thrones are never secure. They are balanced on daggers. And for Eleanor, every alliance was fragile, every friendship conditional. Her enemies painted her scandals not only as sins, but as justifications for rebellion. Why serve a queen who corrupts the realm, they asked. With the church's blessing, rebellious nobles gathered strength. For them, attacking Eleanor was not treason, but piety. And thus the battlefield became an extension of the confessional. But Eleanor was no passive figure waiting for judgment. She knew the mechanics of power better than most men who wore crowns. She rallied her loyalists, secured castles, and negotiated with ruthless precision. If others called her dangerous, she wielded that reputation like armor. Fear became her weapon, just as scandal had been her enemies. The conflicts were as much psychological as military. A victory in court politics could cripple a rival more effectively than a sword. Eleanor maneuvered with brilliance, yet every triumph carried a cost. The more fiercely she fought, the more her enemies clung to their image of her as unnatural, unholy, unfit to rule. What emerged was not simply a queen at war, but a myth in the making. To some, she was a warrior of unmatched resolve. To others, a she-devil tearing Christendom apart. Between those two visions, the truth was buried beneath banners, prayers, and blood. And so Eleanor's reign entered its most perilous chapter, not defined by peace, but by a war where victory could look like defeat. In medieval politics, armies win battles, but reputations decide legacies. And Eleanor's reputation had been under siege longer than any castle. What began as whispers of desire had grown into full-blown legend, one that painted her not as a sovereign, but as a sinner who had poisoned her own crown. Her rivals did not need swords when they had stories. Priests thundered from pulpits, chroniclers inked venom into manuscripts, and bards turned scandal into song. Each tale stretched further from truth, yet the more outrageous it became, the more it was believed. In an age when reputation was survival, Eleanor was bleeding in public view. Even her allies hesitated. Nobles who once swore loyalty now calculated whether her name was more liability than protection. The court that had once sparkled under her command began to fracture, with former friends keeping distance, unwilling to be tainted by association. Isolation crept into her palace, a more suffocating prison than stone walls. For Eleanor, this was the true battlefield, one she could not command with armies or bribes. No decree could silence gossip, no fortress could keep rumor at bay. Her enemies had discovered the weapon she could never deflect the imagination of the people, and so her reign shifted from power to survival. The queen who had once dazzled Europe now stood as a cautionary tale told in hushed tones. Eleanor's name no longer inspired awe, but suspicion. History had judged her not by her victories, but by the shadows painted across her story. And in that darkness, her crown grew heavier than ever. When Eleanor's reign dimmed, the scandal did not die with her. Instead, it calcified into legend. Centuries later, she remains less remembered for her policies, her alliances, or her survival than for the rumors that clung to her like a second skin. To her enemies, this was the final victory. Eleanor would live forever, but as a caricature. Yet legends have a strange resilience. The very stories meant to destroy her also preserved her. Chroniclers who despised her wrote with such obsession that they could not help but immortalize her. Ironically, the queen they sought to erase became unforgettable precisely because of the dirt they hurled at her. And here lies the paradox. Was Eleanor truly the most depraved queen in history, or simply the most slandered? Was her downfall the result of her own ambitions, or of a society eager to demonize powerful women? History offers no final verdict, only fragments, contradictions, and voices echoing through time. But in those echoes lies her enduring power. Eleanor forces us to ask who gets to write history: the victors on the battlefield, or the gossipers who poison the well. Her tale is not merely about lust or politics, but about how narratives can crown or crucify. For modern eyes, Eleanor is both a warning and a fascination. A queen who defied her era's boundaries, and a woman whose story reminds us that reputation can outlast even the sharpest sword. And perhaps that is her greatest legacy, not purity, not scandal, but the proof that power, especially when worn by a woman, was never safe from myth. Eleanor's death should have closed her story, yet strangely her shadow seemed to stretch even further after the grave. Kings and queens who followed often found their reputations measured against hers, as if Eleanor had set the standard for royal scandal. Chroniclers used her name as shorthand for excess, poets painted her as a femme fatale, and moralists warned daughters of nobility with her example. Her legend even slipped into politics. Whenever a queen dared to wield too much influence, whispers of another, Eleanor surfaced. It became a convenient weapon, an easy way to tame women of ambition by dragging an ancient ghost back into the court. Her sins, real or fabricated, turned into a vocabulary of control. But her memory also became strangely liberating. To some, Eleanor embodied defiance. She was the queen who refused to stay quiet, who lived in contradiction, who dared to be more than a ceremonial wife. In her scandal, they glimpsed not only shame, but strength, the refusal to be invisible. Centuries transformed her from a living monarch into a cultural archetype. In paintings, plays, and novels, Eleanor reappeared in different guises: temptress rebel, victim heroine. None of these versions were fully accurate, but all proved her story was too potent to be forgotten. Even now, historians argue, was she a predator or a scapegoat, a danger to her realm or its most convenient distraction? The truth remains elusive. What is certain is that Eleanor left a wound on history, one that refuses to heal because it touches something universal: the uneasy relationship between power, desire, and control. In that sense, Eleanor still reigns not over a kingdom, but over the imagination of every generation that dares to retell her story. Centuries may separate us from Eleanor, but her story feels hauntingly modern. Even today, powerful women are measured less by their achievements and more by the whispers around them. A politician's career can be undone by rumor. A celebrity's image can collapse under scandal. The tools of destruction are the same: gossip, innuendo, moral outrage. Eleanor's world may have been draped in velvet and steel, but the stage looks familiar. Her tale also forces us to rethink how we treat ambition. When a king is ruthless, he is called strong. When a queen shows the same hunger, she is painted as dangerous, unnatural, even depraved. Eleanor lived inside that double standard, and centuries later we still wrestle with it. And then comes the question of truth. In an age of viral headlines and digital myths, how much of what we know is carefully curated slander? Eleanor's fate reminds us that once a narrative takes hold, it can live longer than the person it condemns. Her body turned to dust, yet her reputation, shaped by enemies, still outlives her by hundreds of years. But perhaps there is power in this recognition. If Eleanor's story is anything, it is proof that history is not fixed, it is argued, rewritten, rediscovered. Each generation has the chance to look again, to question, to see not just the scandal, but the person trapped within it. And that is where Eleanor speaks to us most clearly, not as a monster, not as a saint, but as a reminder. Reputation is fragile. Power is costly. And every story, no matter how scandalous, deserves to be told with both caution and courage.